When the annals of Spanish history are unfurled, and historians cast their discerning eyes upon the roster of monarchs, one name emerges from the shadows to claim the ignominious crown of the worst ruler to ever grace the Spanish throne: Ferdinand VII. His name alone sends a shiver through the corridors of time, a figure so universally reviled that every scholar who has dared to dissect his reign arrives at a singular, chilling verdict. There has never been a king more depraved, more cruel, more steeped in sexual deviance than this man who wore the mantle of royalty. The weight of his infamy presses down like a storm cloud over Madrid, a legacy etched not in gold, but in the tears and terror of those who crossed his path. Yet the story you've been fed, tales of noble bloodlines, chivalrous royal marriages, and the dignified splendor of European monarchy, is little more than a gilded lie, a carefully woven tapestry designed to cloak a grotesque truth that festers beneath. Ferdinand VII didn't merely rule Spain, he transformed the royal palace into a den of sexual horror, a place where the echoes of screams mingled with the clink of wine glasses, a realm so depraved that even the most seasoned madame of the roughest brothel would turn away in disgust. Before he earned the moniker El Rey Felon, the Felon King, he was a prince whose very body seemed a mockery of nature, a figure so physically deformed, so sexually incompetent, that his own mother-in-law penned letters dripping with despair, describing him as scarcely a man at all. These are not mere whispers of scandal. They are documented truths, preserved in the trembling hands of royal physicians, the sharp quills of foreign diplomats, and the broken voices of his victims. This convergence of eyewitness accounts, rare in the often sanitized records of European royalty, paints a portrait of a man whose anatomical reality was not just a private shame, but a public catastrophe that would shape a nation's destiny. Imagine, if you will, the weight of such a revelation. This is no dry historical footnote, but a story that shatters the polished veneer of royal power, revealing a tale that is at once pathetically human and terrifyingly monstrous. The most extraordinary case of sexual dysfunction ever recorded in the annals of monarchy. To grasp the depth of this horror, we must journey back to a wedding night in October 1919, an event so infamous that it reverberated through the courts of Europe and even drew the intervention of the Pope himself.
The royal palace of Madrid stood silent that night, its opulent halls holding their breath as a 16-year-old princess, Maria Josefa Amalia of Saxony, sat trembling in her wedding chamber. Raised within the cloistered walls of a convent, her innocence was so profound that she believed babies were born from stalks in the field, a childlike faith unmarred by the harsh realities of the world. Her German attendants, too mortified to enlighten her, had dressed her in white, pressed a rosary into her trembling hands, and left her alone with her prayers. Then the door creaked open, and what stepped into that sacred space was no charming prince from the fairy tales she'd been fed. Instead, it was a 35-year-old man, Ferdinand VII, his frame burdened by excess weight, his gait unsteady from gout, his thick lips curling into a predatory leer, and his eyes glinting with a hunger that belied his royal title. But it was not merely his appearance that froze the young queen's blood in her veins. Ferdinand suffered from a condition so extreme, so grotesque, that modern medicine still grapples with its implications. Macrogenitosomia, a term that masks a reality of monstrously oversized genitals, twisted into a shape that defied nature. The French writer Prosper Mérimée, who later interviewed courtiers present that night, recorded a description that haunts the imagination. Thin as a candle's wax taper at the base, swelling to the thickness of a fist at the end, and stretching as long as a billiard cue. Picture this young girl, sheltered by nuns, suddenly confronted with such a sight. Her innocence shattered in an instant as she bolted from the bed, her screams piercing the night air like a clarion call of terror. Yet the horror did not end there. Ferdinand, fueled by wine and unchecked lust, gave chase, his obese figure lumbering after his fleeing bride in a scene that might have been comic were it not so tragic. The girl, swift and desperate, outran him, her white gown a fleeting ghost in the candlelit chamber. Enraged by this perceived insult to his royal dignity, Ferdinand burst from the bedroom, his deformity exposed to the shocked attendants, and bellowed at them with a fury that shook the walls. He branded them with vile insults, harlots and brutes, demanding they prepare the queen for him within 15 minutes. These poor women, including the Queen's own sister-in-law, were thrust into an impossible task: to explain to a terrified child what awaited her, their words stumbling over the unspeakable. Whatever they managed to convey only deepened the nightmare. For when Ferdinand returned, intent on claiming his marital rights, he was met with a stench no royal perfume could disguise. In her absolute terror, Maria Josepha had lost all control, the wedding bed now a scene of human waste that drove the king back in disgust. "Queens do not possess the fragrance of civet," he sneered, storming out and refusing to touch her for over a week, a mere prelude to the torment that would define her life.
This wedding night was no isolated aberration, but the opening chapter of a reign defined by depravity. A story that demands we peel back the layers of myth to uncover the raw, unvarnished truth. The palace walls, adorned with tapestries of valor, hid a reality where power corrupted not just the soul, but the very flesh of its ruler. As we delve deeper, prepare yourself for a journey into the heart of darkness, where the personal failings of one man cast a shadow over an entire nation, a shadow that lingers still in the whispers of history. The wedding night fiasco of 1819 was but a glimpse into the abyss that was Ferdinand VII's reign, a prelude to a life where his own body became both his tormentor and his weapon. To truly understand how such a night could spiral into a catastrophe that echoed through the courts of Europe, we must turn our gaze to the root of his torment, his anatomical affliction, and its devastating impact on his first marriage to Maria Antonia of Naples. In the year 1702, a young Prince Ferdinand, barely 17 years old, stood before the altar with his cousin, Maria Antonia, a union forged in the cold calculations of royal alliances. The air was thick with expectation, the promise of an heir to secure the Spanish throne hanging like a fragile thread. Yet what unfolded that first wedding night was a scene of awkward fumbling that would set the tone for a marriage doomed from the start. Maria Antonia's letters, penned in the quiet desperation of a bride abandoned by intimacy, reveal a prince who merely gawked at her,
his hands groping her bosom with a clumsy uncertainty, utterly lost in the mechanics of love. He didn't know how sex worked, a revelation that stunned the courts and plunged the young couple into a year-long purgatory of unconsummated vows.
For 11 agonizing months, this marriage remained a hollow shell. The prince's arousal a fleeting spark that fizzled into nothing as he attempted to mount his wife, only to fail time and again. His anatomy, a grotesque distortion of nature, rendered basic human reproduction an unsolvable riddle. The thin base and monstrously swollen end, as described by later witnesses, created a physical barrier that mocked his royal title. Maria Antonia's mother, Queen Maria Carolina of Naples, poured her frustration into increasingly frantic letters, her words a lament for her daughter's nightly tears.
"My child weeps without cease," she wrote. "The prince feels nothing. Attempts to induce him are futile, yielding no pleasure or effect. This is an extraordinary and unfortunate plight for whoever stands at his side."
The royal confessor, a figure of solemn duty, was summoned to intervene. A Catholic priest tasked with the unthinkable, to sit with the future King of Spain and explain in explicit detail the act of marital union. The humiliation rippled through every European court, transforming the Spanish heir into a laughingstock, a physical freak incapable of the most fundamental duty of kingship. When Ferdinand finally breached that barrier after nearly a year of failures, the outcome was catastrophic. Maria Antonia, her body battered by the unnatural demands of her husband's deformity, suffered 2 miscarriages, each a silent testament to the internal injuries she endured. At just 21 years old, her life was snuffed out, her fragile frame broken by a union that should have been her salvation. Yet within this tragedy lies a darker twist. The death of his first wife in 1806 unshackled Ferdinand from the constraints of the marriage bed, unleashing a monstrous obsession that would define his later years. The prince who couldn't perform became a king who couldn't stop, his newfound knowledge of his body fueling a descent into debauchery that would stain the Spanish throne with infamy. Imagine the weight of such a transformation. A young man, once paralyzed by his own inadequacy, now freed to explore the depths of his desires with the impunity of absolute power. The loss of Maria Antonia was not a lesson in restraint, but a catalyst, a moment where the boundaries of morality dissolved. As we peel back the layers of this story, we find not just a man, but a mirror to the excesses of monarchy itself, where personal failings could reshape a nation's fate. The echoes of her suffering linger in the halls of history, a haunting reminder of the price paid for royal ambition. And as Ferdinand stepped into his role as king in 1814, restored to power after Napoleon's defeat, the stage was set for a reign that would blend sexual frustration with unchecked authority, a tale that grows darker with each passing night. The death of Maria Antonia in 1806 marked a turning point for Ferdinand VII, a release from the chains of his first marital failure that unleashed a torrent of pent-up desire and royal arrogance. By 1814, restored to the Spanish throne after Napoleon's defeat, he was a man transformed, now 30 years old, sexually frustrated, and intoxicated by the absolute power that pulsed through his veins. What followed was a decade of debauchery that would rival the excesses of Rome's infamous Caligula, a reign where the royal palace became a mere backdrop to a life of nocturnal vice. Each night, under the cover of a dark cloak, Ferdinand slipped from the palace walls, his destination the seediest brothels of Madrid, where the air was thick with sin and the promise of anonymity. Among these dens of iniquity, one establishment stood out as his favorite, run by a madam known as Pepa la Malagueña, a woman whose name alone was enough to make decent citizens cross the street to avoid the stench of her trade. This was no ordinary brothel, but a notorious lair where the king's darkest impulses found a willing stage. Ferdinand did not venture alone into this underworld. He assembled a crew of young aristocrats, men as morally bankrupt as himself, their titles a hollow shield for their depravity. Together they turned Madrid's red light district into their personal playground, a carnival of excess where the rules of decency were gleefully discarded.
Yet what set Ferdinand apart was not merely his participation, but his perverse pride in the very deformity that had once humiliated him.
That grotesque anatomical gift, once a source of shame, became his twisted badge of honor, transformed into a party trick that appalled even his debauched companions. Multiple witnesses, their stomachs turned by the spectacle, recounted the same stomach-churning scene. The King of Spain, drunk on cheap wine, would challenge his aristocratic friends to measurement contests, a vulgar display where each man exposed himself to compare sizes. Ferdinand always emerged victorious, his monstrous proportions a grotesque crown.
His friends, in a sickening tribute, dubbed him El Bien Dotado, the well-endowed one, a nickname he wore with a strut that echoed through the brothel halls as he bragged of his conquests. But the bragging was merely the surface of a deeper, more disturbing abyss. Ferdinand had cultivated a particular fetish, a perversion that laid bare the true depths of his depravity. In his own words, recorded by Count José María de Villalobos, the king boasted with chilling pride,
"They leave my bed certain that no other man can give them the pleasure I gave them. And do you know what I enjoy most after possessing them? Collecting the rags stained with the proof of their maidenhood." Let that sink in. The King of Spain amassed a collection of blood-stained sheets from the virgins he deflowered, preserving them as trophies, with the same zeal other monarchs reserved for art or jewels, while his neglected second wife oversaw the construction of the Prado Museum.
A beacon of culture rising in Madrid, Ferdinand was curating a chamber of horrors, each bloody rag a testament to his conquests, labeled and stored with meticulous care. This fetish was no medieval relic, but a personal obsession, a grotesque hobby that grew with each encounter. As he traveled across Spain, Ferdinand left a trail of ruined women, widows in Aragon, peasant girls in Sacedon, palace servants too powerless to refuse their king. Each liaison added to his macabre collection, a shadow cast over the land as Spain itself began to crumble under his neglect. While he reveled in his brothel escapades, the nation lost its vast American empire. Liberal reformers were executed by the thousands, and the economy teetered on the brink of collapse.
Yet Ferdinand remained oblivious, his focus fixed on the next night's debauchery, the next trophy to add to his hoard. This was a king who measured his worth not in governance, but in the blood he collected. A man whose personal perversions mirrored the political violence he unleashed. As we delve deeper into this dark saga, prepare yourself for a story where the line between royal power and monstrous impulse blurs into a nightmare that Spain could scarcely escape. The brothels of Madrid were but one stage for Ferdinand VII's depravity, a public theater where his perverse pride played out under the dim glow of candlelight. Yet the true depth of his darkness lay not in the measurement contests or the drunken boasts, but in the chilling fetish that transformed his sexual conquests into a macabre collection, a hoard of blood-stained trophies that whispered of his reign's darkest secrets. These rags, meticulously labeled with dates and names, were more than mere souvenirs. They were symbols of a king who reveled in the violation of innocence, a predator whose appetite grew with each act of possession. Hidden in a cedar chest wrapped in silk, this collection was discovered after his death in 1833, a discovery that sent shockwaves through the Spanish court and beyond. Queen Maria Cristina, his widow, ordered a discreet inventory, but what they unearthed defied belief. dozens of cloth squares, each a grim relic of a life shattered. A testament to a fetish that linked his bedroom horrors to the political violence that defined his rule. The correlation between Ferdinand's sexual exploits and his political ruthlessness is a thread that weaves through the fabric of his reign, a pattern as disturbing as it is undeniable. Historians have long noted that after every liberal uprising he crushed, after every execution he ordered with a stroke of his quill, Ferdinand would add multiple trophies to his collection in rapid succession.
The violence of the throne room seemed to spill into the bedroom, each act of political suppression fueling a frenzied need to assert his dominance over the vulnerable. Imagine the scene, the ink still wet on death warrants, the cries of the condemned fading into the night, only for Ferdinand to seek out his next victim, his hands stained with the blood of both rebellion and maidenhood. It was as if crushing political resistance and crushing female innocence were two sides of the same sick coin, a dual expression of a man who confused power with permission.
Among the inventory, one entry stands out with a chilling clarity. Anna, 15 years, daughter of Colonel Bermudez, February 23, 1823. This name, scrawled on a blood-stained cloth, hints at a story of coercion that reached into the highest echelons of the military. Colonel Bermudez, a loyal officer, may have offered his daughter as a perverse tribute to the king, a sacrifice to secure favor or avoid the gallows. The implications ripple outward. Wives, sisters, daughters of other officers and nobles, all potential targets in a court where loyalty was bought with flesh. The full inventory was never made public, a decision of mercy by Maria Cristina, who ordered the entire collection burned to spare Spain further shame.
Yet before the flames consumed them, several courtiers glimpsed the hoard and recorded their findings, their accounts aligning with a precision that silences any notion of mere gossip. We know Ferdinand kept these trophies. We know he labeled them with care. We know he added to his collection after moments of political violence, each rag a marker of his dual tyranny. This was no isolated aberration, but a systematic pattern, a reflection of a king whose personal perversions mirrored the state's descent into chaos. While he amassed his grotesque gallery, Spain's empire crumbled, its colonies slipping away as Ferdinand's attention remained fixed on his nocturnal pursuits.
The economy faltered, the people starved, and yet the king's chambers grew richer with each new trophy. The courtiers who witnessed this inventory were left with a haunting question. How could a man so consumed by his own desires fail to see the ruin he wrought upon his nation? The answer lies in the intoxicating blend of power and pathology that defined Ferdinand VII, a ruler who turned his deformity into a weapon of terror. As we peer into this abyss, the story grows darker still, a tale where the personal and the political intertwine in a dance of destruction that Spain would struggle to overcome. Amid the swirling chaos of Ferdinand VII's reign, where brothels and blood-stained trophies defined his nights, a glimmer of hope emerged in the form of his second wife, Maria Isabel of Braganza. In 1816, with the Spanish throne teetering on the edge of extinction due to his lack of an heir, Ferdinand turned to his own niece, a 19-year-old Portuguese princess whose plain features and foreign blood made her an easy target for the cruel gossip of the Madrid court. The city's whispers greeted her with a biting rhyme, "Thea, pobre, portuguesa, chukpesa," ugly, poor, and Portuguese, a taunt that underscored her outsider status. Yet Maria Isabel possessed a dignity that her husband could scarcely comprehend, a quiet strength that sought to lift the court from the mire of his depravity. While Ferdinand continued his nocturnal raids on the city's red-light districts, she poured her energy into acts of cultural redemption, quietly founding the Prado Museum and opening the Royal Academy to women artists, a beacon of enlightenment in a palace drowning in darkness. To Ferdinand, however, she was little more than a womb, a vessel to bear the heir he so desperately needed to secure his legacy. He barely noticed her efforts, his mind consumed by the trophies he hoarded and the pleasures he pursued.
Yet in 1818, a flicker of success pierced his reign of failure. Maria Isabel became pregnant, a moment that held the promise of stability for a throne rocked by scandal. But this hope was short-lived, transforming swiftly into a nightmare that would etch her name into the annals of royal tragedy. When she went into labor, complications arose with a ferocity that stunned the royal physicians. The baby was breech, its position a deadly obstacle, and the queen's strength began to fade as the hours dragged on. The surgeons faced an agonizing choice: save the mother or the child. Ferdinand, with a coldness that belied his royal title, issued his command without hesitation: save the child, cut her if you must, a decision that sealed Maria Isabel's fate.
What followed was witnessed by 12 individuals, their accounts aligning in a harrowing chorus of horror. This was 1818, an era where anesthesia was a crude mix of alcohol and opium, barely enough to dull the sharpest pain. The surgeons, believing the queen unconscious, sliced into her abdomen to perform an emergency cesarean. But Maria Isabel was awake, her eyes snapping open midway through the procedure as a scream tore from her throat, echoing through the palace like a wail of the damned. The surgeons, gripped by panic, continued their butchery as she writhed in agony, her body betraying her with every cut. The baby, already dead for hours, offered no salvation, and Maria Isabel bled out on the operating table, her final moments a crucible of unimaginable suffering, sacrificed for a child that would never draw breath. At 21 years old, her life was extinguished, a casualty of her husband's callous ambition.
The Queen's sister publicly pointed an accusing finger at Ferdinand, her voice a rare challenge to his authority, while palace whispers speculated that his deformed anatomy had caused the conception complications, or that his syphilis, contracted from years of brothel visits, had poisoned the pregnancy, leading to the stillbirth. Yet Ferdinand felt no remorse, his heart a fortress against guilt. Within a year, he was already seeking a third wife, his need for an heir undimmed by the blood on his hands. If Maria Isabel's death was a tragedy born of neglect, the fate of his next bride would plunge the court into a depth of obscenity that even the Pope could not ignore.
The story of Maria Josepha, the 16-year-old who soiled herself on her wedding night, was merely the opening act of a marital horror show that would test the limits of human endurance. As we turn the page on this chapter, the shadow of Ferdinand's reign grows longer, a tale where love and power twist into a grotesque dance of despair. The death of Maria Isabel in 1818 left Ferdinand VII undeterred, his quest for an heir driving him to seek a third wife with the same ruthless determination that had defined his reign. In 1819, he turned his gaze to Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony, a 16-year-old princess plucked from the sheltered confines of a convent. Her innocence a stark contrast to the depravity she was about to face. We've already glimpsed the horror of their wedding night in October of that year, a scene etched into history by her terrified flight and the grotesque chase that followed. Yet that initial encounter was but a prelude to a marital nightmare that would stretch across a decade. After a week of refusing to touch his bride, repulsed by the aftermath of her fear-induced loss of control, Ferdinand returned to her chamber with a renewed resolve. Maria Josepha, raised to be meek and obedient, surprised even herself with a fierce resistance, biting, scratching, and delivering a kick to his monstrous genitals. But resistance could only hold so long against the will of a king. Ferdinand, accustomed to bending others to his desires, adopted a new strategy: patience, a virtue he wielded like a weapon. Night after night, he entered her chamber, his presence a looming shadow as she clutched her rosary, praying for deliverance. Maria Josepha's ignorance became her shield. She genuinely believed babies came from stalks. A childlike faith that turned Ferdinand's attempts to educate her into a battle of wills. When he tried to explain the facts of life, she recoiled, accusing him of weaving vile lies to trick her into mortal sin. God would not create such a method of creating life, she declared with the conviction of the devout, her voice trembling yet resolute. You are testing my virtue with these falsehoods. Weeks turned to months, and the court buzzed with whispers. Foreign ambassadors reporting back to their governments with thinly veiled amusement. The King of Spain, famed for his brothel con, humiliated yet undaunted, Ferdinand played his ultimate card, penning a letter to Pope Pius VII, an elderly Italian who had weathered Napoleon's storms and thought himself beyond shock. The missive, preserved in the Vatican archives, must have tested even the Pope's faith. A king, defender of the Catholic faith, beseeching the Holy Father to convince his wife to consummate their marriage. The Pope's response, a masterpiece of diplomatic tact, gently reminded Maria Josepha that marital relations were not only permitted, but a sacred duty, a divine mandate to produce an heir. Yet even this papal edict could not break her spirit entirely. She agreed to submit, but only under her own terms. She would pray the entire rosary before each encounter, keep her eyes closed throughout, and focus her mind on anything but the act. Ferdinand, the king who collected virgin blood as trophies, was reduced to begging for the slightest sign of enthusiasm from his own wife, their union a purgatory of rosary. For a decade, this matrimonial ordeal persisted, yielding no child despite the nightly rituals. When Maria Josepha died in 1829 at the age of 25, officially of fever, the court exhaled a collective sigh of relief, her passing a release from a marriage that had been a prison for them both. Ferdinand had failed again. 3 wives, 2 dead, and still no legitimate heir. His body, ravaged by decades of debauchery and disease, seemed to mock his royal ambitions. Yet this chapter of his story leaves us with a haunting question. In the face of such relentless horror, how did Maria Josepha find the strength to resist, even for a moment? What stories of resilience lie buried in the silence of her convent upbringing, waiting to be uncovered? I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Did her faith give her courage, or was it something deeper? Let's explore this together. Thanks for listening. Please leave a comment if you have different thoughts on what I shared.